What is up, guys? My name is Nathan, and today I'm going to show you how to use the basic adjustment sliders in Lightroom CC. Starting off, I'm going to use this image I took of my brother, and we're just going to adjust this image because I feel like it could use a couple of these adjustments. So starting off, we have in the basic tab, right at the top of the array of different editing tabs you have in Lightroom, you have different treatment options for color and black and white, and I think it's pretty obvious what they do. Color is for color and black and white is for obviously black and white. And then moving down, you have a couple ways to adjust your temperature of the photo. If you shot in RAW, then you have full temperature details of the photo and you can play with it however you want. You can either just slide the temperature slider and get a cooler temperature if you go to the left, or if you slide it way to the right, you'll get a very warm and yellowy sunset-like temperature. If you double click on the slider, it will set back to the default value, how it was shot, or if you move something down here, it will go back to 0. Alright, now you also have an option to select a white balance point for your image. If you have something that you know was supposed to be white when you shot the photo, then you can use this picker tool for the key of W if you press this little hotkey, and you go to something that's white or gray, you can click it, and it will set the white balance according to what it thinks this should be as white. So as you can see, it warmed up the entire image, and I think it did a pretty good job. You also have different white balance selectors here, and if you just toggle through them, you can see that they do different things, and it's just a preset essentially. So however, I'm just going to leave it a bit cooler because that's the kind of feel I want to go for this shot. Down here in the tint slider, it adjusts green on the left and like a pinkish red on the right. Usually if I'm doing a portrait, I don't usually adjust this slider too much outside of what the camera puts it on for me, so I'm just going to leave it at that. Moving on, down here in the tone adjustments, you have an auto option, and usually I don't do anything that's auto because it doesn't really know the kind of image I'm going for. As you can see, it overexposed his face, and it just made a technically correct exposure, which isn't really what I want to go for. So as you can see, it just brightened everything up until everything is in the mid-tones and there's just not a lot of contrast in the image. So I'm going to go ahead and Control Z that so it undoes and start with the exposure. For this image, I'm just going to increase the exposure a little bit because it was a bit dark. And when you increase the exposure, everything is globally adjusted. So all the detail, shadows, highlights, and midtones are increased if you go to the right, and then they're decreased if you go to the left. So for this image, I'm just going to start out and go right about plus 36 exposure. That's 0.36. And down here in the contrast slider, you have two options as well. You can go to the left and it decreases the contrast, or you can go to the right and increase contrast. Now on any of these sliders, you can overdo it pretty easily depending on how far you go. Obviously, I don't want to do this for a portrait because it doesn't really make him look that great, and it just doesn't look that great as a photo. So usually I'll go right about there. I think that looks pretty good to me with contrast. And now moving on, you have the highlight slider, shadow slider, whites, and black sliders. These sliders do just exactly what they say. Highlights will adjust the highlights or the brighter points in the image. So right here, you can see that his skin is brighter, his face is a highlight, down here in the shoes is a highlight. So everything that's brighter in the image is going to be affected by the highlights. So if I bring that up, you can see that his whole body has been brightened, and nothing else has really been affected aside from some of these things right here in midtones and slight highlights. So knowing that, I just want to bring him out a little bit from the photo, and I think right about plus 50 is good. Now if you go into negative highlight, it decreases the highlights. So everything that you see that I just pointed out, it's going to decrease the luminance values of that. So keeping that in mind, I'm just going to go back up to plus 50 or so, and then move on down to the shadows. Shadows does exactly the opposite of what the highlight slider does, and if you go into negative shadows, it darkens everything that's in a shadow or dark light, and if you go into positive shadows, it just increases everything. Pretty intuitive, right? So for this photo, I kind of want a dark feel, so I'm just going to decrease the shadows to about negative 30 or so. Alright, and then moving down to the whites and black slider, and these are interesting because if you hold Alt and then slide left or right, you'll see that the image disappears, and it's all black. And if you slide way to the right, you'll see that part of the image comes back. But what does this mean? Well, everywhere that you see color or white or practically anything that's not black, that means that the whites are being overexposed. See, if I let go of Alt, everything is very, very bright, and it's not the kind of image I want to go for. So just holding Alt and adjusting the whites and black slider while viewing this lets you see just exactly what is clipping in the highlights. And when you clip a highlight, that means you're losing detail. So you don't really want to lose detail. So I think right about there, just before we start clipping too much, looks good. And as you can see, it's a lot better than down here at 0. So it just adds a little bit of finesse to the photo, I guess. And if you do the same thing for the black slider, you just hold Alt and slide back. Usually I like to clip a little bit of the blacks because I don't find it as detrimental as losing detail on the highlights, because I just think it looks nicer for stuff like this especially. Alright, and then down in clarity, we have 2 ways to go. If you go negative clarity, it's going to decrease the contrast in the mid-tones. And it just makes everything look very soft and very opposite to plus clarity. It makes everything look very grungy, especially faces. And if you wanted to take a portrait, I wouldn't recommend going very high on the clarity slider, just because it doesn't make for very flattering images. So I'm just going to leave that pretty low. I think +7 looks good because I want to go for a little bit of a grungy look. Alright, and then down here in the vibrance, just increases the color vibrance of whatever colors you have in the image. See right here I have some yellow, greens, and different blues here in this jeans. I think that's blue at least. Yeah, it's like a dark blue. And then you've got reds. So everything that's, a color is going to be increased in vibrance. And if you go way too far, it kind of destroys an image. And if you go into the negative vibrance, it makes it more of a grayscale. So I'm just going to increase the vibrance a little bit, maybe +12 or so. I think that looks all right. And then saturation is something I don't use as often. Negative saturation just takes all the color out of an image. And if you go into plus saturation, it adds a lot of saturation to the colors that are already there. As you can see, skin tones are a color, and they can make you look very orange, and it's not usually what you're going for. They kind of look like the little guys from Willy Wonka. So I'm not going to add any saturation because I don't think it really adds color in the same way as vibrance does, so I'm not a big fan of saturation, but I do like vibrance. It's more subtle, and I just find myself using it more. Alright, so I think this image is about done. If you press Y on your keyboard, it will bring you into a split screen view for before and after you edited, and you can see obviously this is before we did any of the basic exposure adjustments, and this is after, and I am very happy with the result. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you learned something from it. Thanks for watching.